The first speaker is going to be, these are all three topics on one way or another on St. Petersburg. Will be Chris Berger, and he's going to be speaking on Go to the Dogs, a history of St. Petersburg's Derby Lane. And Mr. Berger has a master's in historic preservation from the University of Florida and also a bachelor of journalism from the University of Florida. And as well, he's worked for preservation in Atlanta, Nantucket, Tallahassee, and has done some other volunteer work in the preservation field, worked as an architectural historian, and even done some copy editing for a newspaper. So he's widely experienced in these areas. So Mr. Berger.
Thank you. I hope everyone's enjoying their conference. My name is Chris Berger. I'm an architectural historian at ACI, which is in Sarasota, Florida. And it was through my job that I had the opportunity to research the history of Derby Lane, which is here in St. Petersburg. And it's a historic Greyhound Racing track that is called the Churchill Downs of Greyhound tracks, and it's also billed as the oldest continuously operated Greyhound track in the world. But before we get to the history of Derby Lane, some background on Greyhound racing. It originated from the English pastime of coursing, in which two greyhounds are set free to chase after a rabbit, and a judge follows them and assesses them on how much athleticism they exhibit in the pursuit. And coursing made its way to the United States, where this man, Owen P. Smith, watched a race in Hot Springs, Arkansas in 1905. And he didn't have a stomach for the violence involved because, of course, at the end, the greyhounds killed the rabbit. So he was an amateur inventor, and he set out to make a more peaceful way for the greyhounds to show their athleticism. So he invented the mechanical lure that ran around the track on the outside of an oval, and it spawned the spectator sport of greyhound racing. He opened the first track in 1919 in Emeryville, California, and it quickly got shut down because gambling inevitably became a part of it, and gambling was illegal. So he kept crossing the country, opening tracks, and soon the sport really caught on, particularly in the 1920s. Now, in this time, Florida was undergoing a development boom. And so promoters needed something to entertain all those tourists and new residents who were moving to the state. And since greyhound racing was suddenly so popular, a bunch of tracks went up. Approximately 20 were built throughout the state. And one of them was Derby Lane, which is located, it's the yellow dot on the top of the screen. We're at the blue dot, so it's about 7 or 8 miles north of here. It was built, it was kind of an out-of-way location at the time. This is 1923 when a group of St. Petersburg businessmen acquired the land from T.L. Weaver, who owned a lot of lumber property. And the location was important because it was near the end of the recently completed Gandy Bridge, which was the first to span Tampa Bay and link Tampa to St. Petersburg. Before then, you had to drive all the way around Tampa Bay to get from Tampa to St. Petersburg or vice versa. So it was a long, arduous journey, and the bridge really cut down the commute time. So it took advantage of the proximity to both municipalities. This is what the track looked like. As I said, Weaver sold the land to this group of businessmen. They built a sand track and grandstand, but before that they could hold their first race, they must have run into financial problems because the property reverted back to Weaver. And he, along with his brother-in-law, John Lowbridge, they carried out their mission to open the Greyhound track, which at the time was known as the St. Petersburg Kennel Club. The first race was held on January 3rd, 1925, and a crowd of 4,000 people were there. This isn't from the actual first race, but it's of the period. They also built a wooden clubhouse next to the grandstand, which resembles a plantation house. And you can see the track on the outer oval where the lure ran. Here's another picture from that period. sometime around 1930s, they built a Art Deco style judges stand and Art Deco style odds board. Now, the track was a very popular place in the area, as evidenced by this photo, which shows Babe Ruth, third from right, at a trophy presentation for one of the winning dogs. On the far left is another Yankee great, Lou Gehrig. And the flash of the camera must have been bright because Lou Gehrig's eyes are shut and the dog's handler is covering the dog's eyes. But the dog doesn't seem to mind very much. Babe Ruth was the life of the party, and apparently Derby Lane was the party, because here he is again in a white shirt with the number 1. To the far left is another baseball great, Dizzy Dean. There's a lot of whimsy involved with a day at the St. Petersburg Kennel Club. Here's a marching band on the track. They had the marching band until the 1990s. They also had car races around the Sand Oval. And when they did have Greyhound Racing, they were known to dress up monkeys as jockeys and attach them on the back of the Greyhounds. And here's what that looked like. This isn't from Derby Lane necessarily, but that's to give you an idea what it looked like. Now, I don't think any animal particularly like this, because greyhounds are known to reach speeds of 45 miles per hour. And when they started going that fast, the monkeys would freak out and start biting the greyhounds. So it was not opportunistic for either animal. But the track persisted, and at the tender age of 14, it already was billing itself as the oldest in the world. That's because a lot of the other tracks that were built before it had been shut down because of illegal gambling. Derby Lane got around this by the dog owners would sell shares in the dogs. So even if your dog in a particular race lost, you can return your ticket and still get something back, maybe a nickel. It survived. There was some years during and after World War II where racing was paused in the United States, but it survived stronger than ever and expanded in 1950. They replaced the original Grandstand with this mid-century modern example. It was by the firm of William Harvard, who's also responsible for the inverted pyramid pier here in St. Petersburg, which is kind of a controversial issue. Here's some photos to show what the Grandstand looked like in about 1950, a very popular place. Here's from the parking lot what it looked like. Here's an aerial view. This must have been either during or shortly after construction, because there's a lot of debris in the parking lot. Either that's remnants of the original wood grandstand or that's construction materials for the new grandstand. There's a lot of great postcards affiliated with Derby Lane. Here's just a few of them.
Churchill's Down is in May. What is it for the Greyhound?
What was that?
Churchill Downs for the horses is in May. Kentucky Derby. What is it for the horse, for the dogs?
That's a very good question. We have 2 people affiliated with Derby Lane in the audience, and I'm sure they'll be happy to answer that question after this. This is probably about 1970. We know this because the building to the left of the grandstand is called the Derby Club, and it was put up in 1967, as well as the paddocks, which are just south of that. And here's the look from 1976 when they expanded the grandstand. It's called the Derby Plaza building. It's an enclosed glass building. And here's a photo from probably the peak for Derby Lane in 1986 when they had a crowd of more than 10,000 people attend a race. 2 years later, Florida introduced the lottery, and that did a lot of damage to Derby Lane's business. And since then, the state has rolled out more legalized forms of gambling, such as slot machines and poker. Before then, the only legalized forms of gambling in the state were pari-mutuel tracks like Derby Lane. And also, starting in the 1970s, there was a lot of exposés on the negative aspects to Derby Lane, or Greyhound Racing in general, and that took away a lot of potential new fans. Here's what it looks like today. It's still kept in immaculate condition. This is the grandstand from the parking lot. My friend on the bottom right really wanted to be in this photo. To get the main entrance, you travel through this ramped up tunnel, and it leads to a view of the infield and the odds board. The odds board was built in about 1950. They've changed it a little bit, but still relatively the same. Here's a panoramic view of the track. There's that grandstand, looks exactly the same. The Derby Plaza building, which is connected to the right of the grandstand, it's been mothballed. It's no longer used. And that's the Derby Club building, where they have stadium seating and TVs which show the race, dining tables. This is my favorite feature of the park. It's the neon light-up sign at the ticket window. Here's another view of it. It lights up to show a greyhound in stride. But it's about 15 years old because it was added during filming of Ocean's 11. And here's the scene from the movie this is Carl Reiner and Brad Pitt sitting on one of the benches along the track. George Clooney also filmed scenes in the parking lot. And here's a mural that's in the paddock area. Every race begins the same. The dogs are led from the paddock to the finish line, where they're introduced in chronological order. Inevitably, one dog decides to relieve themselves at the time. They're taken down to the starting box, and it's lifted, and they take off after the stuffed animal lure, which is appropriately named Harrison because it's a stuffed rabbit. And here's another view of them coming around a turn in pursuit. Anyone who's spent time at a racetrack knows that it attracts an interesting mix of people, and here's some of the people that I encountered on my day at Derby Lane. The gentleman in the top right didn't seem very pleased to be in my photo. Since 1997, poker has been a big revenue generator for Derby Lane. The state legislature passed a law that year which allowed pari-mutuel tracks to allow table games like poker. And they said that they had to hold 90% of the races that they held the year before, which is 1996. And this rule has been in place ever since. Now, there's been a recent effort to decouple this provision, which says that racetracks must have races in order to offer poker. And the officials at Derby Lane were in favor of this because the tracks that give Greyhound Racing a bad name are the ones that are just going through the motion and holding dog racing just to offer poker. But Derby Derby Lane wants to have poker and dog racing. And it looked like in the latest session in the state legislature that this amendment was going to pass, but as of Tuesday, it was pulled. So it's not going to happen this time. So what does the future hold for Derby Lane? I think eventually that amendment will pass, either next legislative session or a couple of years from now. And then a lot of Greyhound tracks are going to go out of business. In the United States, there are about 20 to 25 still in existence. And it's a big deal in Florida because there are 12 in Florida still in operation. So I think at that time, those tracks in Florida, half of them, maybe 25% will go out of business. Derby Lane wants to keep racing. I imagine they'll cut back on their races. Right now they have racing year-round. They originally had it 90 days. So I think they may go back closer to that original 90 days calendar. And once the other tracks go out of business, I think the anti-Greyhound racing groups are going to come after tracks like Derby Lane that still hold races in full force. I have a feeling that Derby Lane is going to be the holdout. They'll have racing as long as possible. So thank you very much.